He started life as the son of a railroad mechanic in Tyler, Texas, then dropped out of school at age 15 to hitchhike to California, where he believed he was destined to become a photographer. Instead, he became the roustabout for a traveling medicine man known more for his fraudulent snake oil schemes than his medical knowledge. He claimed a Portuguese heritage, pretended to be a Raja from a foreign land who could tell your fortune for a fee. He got behind the wheel of a race car for the first time, not because it was his passion, but because it turned out to be a great way to promote the aftermarket headers he was selling on commission. But soon, he fell in love. Our mystery man went by many names: Dewey Gatson, Jack DeSoto, Raja del Ramascus, and finally, Rajo Jack. He changed identities on a whim, not because he was trying to put one over on anyone, but because he was a black man in America trying to make a career for himself in the deeply segregated motorsport scene of the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. Today on Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, we're going to delve deeper into the racial divides that plagued American motorsport for decades by looking into the exceptional story of one of the country's first black racers, Rajo Jack. Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. For most of early American motorsport history, the biggest race that every driver aspired to compete in was the Indianapolis 500. The massive event, first hosted in 1911, was prestigious, yes, but that prestige grew only more and more as the years passed. If you were an aspiring racer in the United States before World War II, then the Indy 500 represented the pinnacle of what you could achieve domestically. Your path to the big 500-mile sweepstakes would likely begin with one local track hosting a championship. As your name gained status, you could command higher appearance fees from other racetracks in your area, so you'd head off to race there as well. If you were really good, you'd start competing in the next state over, or commit to a few weeks on the road every year in hopes of building your profile. Then, come the month of May, if someone hadn't already approached you to compete at the Indy 500, well, you just headed off to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Once you got there, perhaps you could convince someone to give you a car, or maybe you'd be recruited to substitute for a different driver partway through the race. There's just one caveat. You had to have a AAA racing license. As we've touched on in previous episodes of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, early motorsport was governed by the Contest Board of the American Automobile Association, an organization we now know for its slate of emergency roadside assistance services and not its competitive past. But until 1955, the AAA was the de facto sanctioning body in America. If you wanted to race at the Indy 500, well, you better be on good terms with the AAA. That's a lot easier said than done. To get a license, you needed to submit an application to your local AAA director, who would then decide whether or not he wanted to grant you that license. If you ever made that director mad, he could revoke that license in an instant. To maintain your AAA license, you also could only compete in AAA sanctioned races. And depending on where you lived, those races could be pretty rare. Where they existed, AAA events were reliable. They ran on the same general set of rules and awarded a decent amount of guaranteed money for showing up or for winning a race. Any race not sanctioned by the AAA was termed an outlaw race. If a AAA driver was caught competing in one of those outlaw events, his license could be immediately revoked, thus completely ruining his chance of ever racing at the coveted Indianapolis 500. So why would anyone in their right mind try to race one of those outlaw races? Especially if you couldn't even rely on an outlaw promoter to pay you afterward. Well, sometimes those outlaw promoters did pay you, and their promised purses could be truly exceptional. Sometimes you just simply couldn't get to a AAA sanctioned track, so you had to make do with what you've got nearby. And sometimes you just weren't the right kind of person to earn a AAA license. See, only white men were encouraged to apply for AAA racing and mechanics licenses, and only white men were approved. That meant only white men were allowed to enter the track and race. Women were roundly denied, and so were people of color. In fact, in the pre-World War II era, many racetracks were segregated, meaning that black folks were confined to a specific grandstand separated from the whites. Some black men did manage to earn a AAA license. For example, boxer Jack Johnson earned a name for himself in 1910 when he took down Jim Jeffries. Johnson was a black man who was deemed one of the finest boxers in the world, but boxing was still segregated for much of his career. When he beat Jeffries, who was known as the Great White Hope, Johnson shocked the world and became a star. Part of that stardom involved taking part in other sporting events staged by folks hungry for publicity. Racer Barney Oldfield was one such man, and he invited Johnson to compete against him in a motor race in late 1910. In order for the match to be considered legal, Johnson had to apply for a AAA racing license. And surprisingly, he earned one. But the license lasted only as long as it took for someone on the contest board to realize Johnson was black. They revoked the license immediately afterward and also threatened to revoke Oldfield's as well. Infuriated, Johnson wrote to the AAA saying, "You are in error when you state that I obtained the license by trickery or misrepresentation. You cannot blame me for your lack of office system. I will go to the courts if necessary to secure my rights and privileges." He did not have his racing license reinstated, and Oldfield decided to risk his own to compete against him. That kind of thing could be quite common if a AAA representative wasn't familiar with a driver submitting an application. One big problem with the AAA's rules, aside from the fact that they were designed to segregate the motorsport community, was that those rules were never really written down. If you're familiar with the history of Major League Baseball, you'll know something similar was in effect there too, some sort of gentleman's agreement that black people and white people should not compete in the same league. All the men in power decided that they wouldn't let people of color enter their competitions, and that was that. So if you were a black racing driver, you were effectively stuck between a rock and a hard place. Nothing in the official AAA rules said you had to be white, so maybe there just hadn't been a black racer good enough to earn a license. Maybe you could be that first black driver. Maybe someone, somewhere along the way, would see beyond the color of your skin and give you a license. The problem was finding that person. And even if you did find them, how are you supposed to prove you warranted a license? And if you got a license, how could you guarantee that a AAA representative in a different region didn't just take it away? How would you ever find a way to compete in AAA and not outlaw races if all you could compete in were outlaw races? And if you couldn't compete in those outlaw races, how are you ever supposed to get to the Indianapolis 500? The rules to the racing game were rigged and seemingly unwinnable. But that didn't stop Rajo Jack from trying. Are you tired of the same old motorsport merch? Me too. That's why this season, Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys is partnering with Homefield Apparel, a sporting apparel company that has released some exceptional collections inspired by the racing world. If you're looking for great shirts and hats designed right in Speedway, Indiana, right next to the racetrack, head down to the description to learn more about Homefield. And don't forget to use code DPTJ15 for 15% off your first purchase. To start off our story, we need to look back to 1863, the year the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in the United States, and thousands upon thousands of slaves suddenly found themselves free. That is, if anyone bothered to tell them. While freedom was a good first step in reaffirming the basic human rights of the generations of black folks who had been forcibly removed from their home and sold to white landowners in order to live out a life of indentured servitude, it was only that, a first step. The Emancipation Proclamation offered nothing else by way of money, education, or any other skill that could actively advance the livelihoods of people who had once been bought and sold like animals. Many former slaves transitioned from a life of forced manual labor to a life of manual labor they chose for themselves. After all, they had nowhere to go, and many slave owners offered them an opportunity to continue living on the property and farming the land, albeit now for meager pay or for the promise that if they worked hard, maybe one day they'd earn a sliver of that land for themselves. Rajo Jack's paternal grandmother, Quilla, was one such person. As a young domestic servant, she worked inside the comfortable home of the Gastons, a family of lawmakers and landowners that founded an empire on the backs of slave labor and continued to profit from the servitude of the people they once owned after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. Someone in the Gaston household impregnated Quilla, and in 1877 she gave birth to a young boy she named Noah. Noah later went on to marry a woman named Mattie Anderson. And when she died, he remarried Frances Scott. 10 months after marrying Frances, on July 28, 1905, Dewey Gatson was born. Gatson, not Gaston. The Gaston family gave their slaves a bastardized version of their surname, and for many, it was the only name they knew. Dewey Gatson was tall and rambunctious, but he was born with a much lighter skin tone than his parents, a trait that he would use to serve himself well in the future. Dewey Gatson saw his first car in Tyler, Texas, when one showed up in town as part of the Ringlings Brothers Circus, and he learned the basics of mechanics from his father Noah, who evolved into a capable railroad machinist. But Frances Gatson wasn't happy. She had given birth to another child, and then another, and their living quarters were becoming packed. With racial tensions also rising in Tyler, the family made a move to Bakersfield, California, where Frances thought she could earn work with distant family members. She did, but her husband Noah didn't. The big California move lasted for less than a year, but there was one particular encounter that intrigued a young Dewey Gatson. Only one photographer in the town of Bakersfield would work with black families, and Frances had sought him out for a family portrait to celebrate their new life. That photographer's name, at the time, was M.B. Marcel, and Dewey Gatson was fascinated by him. The young man frequented the photo studio during the brief time his family lived in California, and he thought he'd found his calling. He was going to become a photographer. He held on to that dream even after his family returned to Texas, and in 1920, at 50 years old, Dewey Gatson got back on a train. He was going back to California, back to Bakersfield, where he would find M.B. Marcel and become a photographer's apprentice. There was just one problem. He couldn't find Marcel. See, yes, Marcel was a photographer. He was even popular. He'd photographed Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders in Cuba for the New York Journal. But he was also a serial con man, hopping from one city to the next, selling raffle tickets for a raffle that didn't exist. In 1920, he'd moved up to Washington to try his hand at scamming upstate, taking on the name Doc Marcel and selling snake oil potions to desperate buyers. Dewey Gatson got on a train and headed to Seattle, where he learned that Doc Marcel had moved to Portland. Back on a train he went, and finally, he found the good doctor. Marcel had entirely forgotten about his previous offer of an apprenticeship to a young, curious child, but He was planning on taking his medicine show on the road, and so he needed a mechanic to fix up the cars. Dewey Gatson had some mechanical skill that he learned from his father, so Doc Marcel hired him to fix the trucks, drive them to new towns, and set up all the tents for his big medicine show. It was Marcel who first suggested an alternative persona for Dewey Gatson. Oregon was plagued with the Ku Klux Klan members and had passed horrifying exclusion laws that were designed to place limitations on black people. Marcel decided Dewey should adopt a Portuguese persona. After all, few folks in Portland had likely met anyone from Portugal, and to start calling himself Jack DeSoto. Our protagonist, the newly crowned Jack DeSoto, got his first taste of motorsport as part of the medicine show. As he waited for Marcel to photograph stationary cars during a rained-out event at the Multnomah County Fair, he struck up a conversation with a man named Joe Jägersberger. Jägersberger was born in Austria and grew into a competent engineer and racer. He immigrated to America, where he later formed a company named the Rajo Manufacturing Company. The biggest piece of equipment he sold was an overhead valve conversion head for the omnipresent Model T. It could make twice the horsepower of a standard Model T engine, and that header quickly became a hit with the racing community. But Jägersberger knew that business was outpacing his abilities, and he asked a young Jack DeSoto if he'd like to become the exclusive Rajo salesman in the Portland area. Each Rajo head cost somewhere between $60 and $80, and Jack DeSoto could keep $10 from every sale and charge an additional $10 to install the headers on a customer car. Jack DeSoto agreed on the spot. And so the young boy from Tyler, Texas was once again renamed. He was now Rajo Jack. As part of his marketing schemes, Rajo Jack posed with a race car, took photos, and began attending as many races as he could, playing up his faux Portuguese heritage in order to make it into the pits at races where black men were barred from everywhere but a specific grandstand. He continued playing up that role with Marcel's medicine show as well, where he draped himself in silk robes and pretended to tell fortunes under the name Raja del Ramascus. Though he never had much of an interest in racing, he finally caught the bug on July 4th, 1922. He made a 10-hour trek to Tacoma Speedway to watch a AAA sanctioned event, and he met the iconic Barney Oldfield, who took time out of his day to chat with Rajo. Charmed by Oldfield and entranced by the race cars, he determined then and there to build his own machine and start racing. The next year, he earned a provisional AAA license after he produced forged paperwork proving that he was Portuguese, and after so few cars showed up to a race in Vancouver, Washington, that officials needed a field filler. He finished 7th out of 8 cars on the track, but by that time, the local AAA officials had caught on to his game. They pulled Rajo Jack to the side after the event and told him to never come back. That could have been the end of his racing career, especially as the AAA was becoming ever more popular in the West. But as Doc Marcel found more trouble with the law and Rajo's job became shakier, he started to look deeper into the racing scene to see what other opportunities he could find. Rajo, therefore, discovered a burgeoning outlaw racing community. The AAA charged such high sanctioning fees that some race promoters at certain tracks could barely break even at the end of a massively popular race weekend. These promoters began increasingly hosting outlaw races, those events not sanctioned by the AAA. While some unscrupulous promoters used outlaw racing as an excuse to bilk drivers out of their prize money, there were plenty of others who understood that outlaw races could be a great source of income if they played their cards right. At just 19 years old, Rajo Jack realized this outlaw market could be his best shot at establishing a racing career, and in June of 1924, he packed up his race car and headed down to an event at Culver City. Organizers had promoted such a massive prize purse that some local AAA racers had even opted to go outlaw just for a shot at making good money. But that was Rajo's last race for some time, although not from lack of trying. He would turn up to tracks all over the West Coast, only to be turned away at the gate thanks to the color of his skin. He didn't compete again until 1926, when a circuit called Bagley Track allowed him to race for the full season. At Bagley, Rajo Jack met a young man named Francis Quinn. Quinn came from a wealthier family and only got started racing after he secured a degree in college, at which point it became clear he had talent. That year, he and Rajo pitted next to each other at a track, and the two became inseparable. They staged a series of match races designed to play up the black versus white sentiment, and when Quinn moved to Pasadena to compete in better racing circles, he was persistent in convincing Rajo to move down south too. In 1928, Rajo did. He got a job as a car washer and rented a room in San Jose, but his racing hopes diminished. He no longer had his car, and because he was an unknown entity, no one would let him drive their machinery. When things looked totally helpless, Quinn stepped in to offer Rajo a bed to sleep in down in Pasadena. There, the young aspiring racer started all over again. Rajo found a room to rent and became one of the best and only black mechanics in town. In 1929, with Quinn vouching for him, Rajo Jack was able to earn a AAA mechanics license, the first of its kind awarded to a black man. With it, he could join Quinn in the pits at Legion Ascot Speedway, where his handiwork was instantly clear via Quinn's performances. And with his mechanics license, Rajo could also take Quinn's car for a spin in practice. He hoped it would be enough to convince the AAA that he deserved a race seat. 2 years later, the duo were still working together when Francis Quinn was invited to drive the Tucker Tappet Special at the 1931 Indianapolis 500. It was a huge honor, and he invited Rajo Jack to be his riding mechanic for the event. At the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, though, officials refused to let Rajo into the garage. The Indy 500 was sanctioned by the AAA, so in theory, Rajo's AAA mechanic license should have been enough to earn him a place in the garage. But the officials at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway still refused on the grounds that they were the ones who decided who could enter their garages at their track, not some random guy in California. If Rajo Jack wanted into the garage, they told him, he'd have to be a janitor, and he could only work at night when everyone else left. Quinn was furious, but after ample protests, he found there was nothing he could do. So Rajo donned a janitor's uniform and whiled away the midnight hours in the garage every night, preparing Quinn's car while everyone else slept. He wasn't allowed to serve as a riding mechanic as he'd hoped, and on race day, to add insult to injury, he found he was only allowed to watch the race from a black-only grandstand. Sadly, Quinn's Indy 500 ended on lap 3, and at the end of the year, he also lost his life, towing his race car to an event at Oakland. A drunk driver crashed into Quinn's tow truck, and Quinn was killed after being thrown from the car. Rajo was shocked. He was supposed to go with Quinn to that race, but ultimately determined the route was too dangerous for a black man to traverse. The decision saved his life, but his closest friend and ally was dead. Quinn's family wanted to honor their deceased relative by continuing to race the car Quinn had painstakingly assembled. They asked Rajo to stay on as the mechanic, but to expand his responsibilities to getting the car to the track, finding drivers to compete in the car, and making sure it was ready to race. If Rajo could earn the family the $6,000 it took Francis Quinn to build his car, then they would let Rajo keep the high-powered Miller engine. In 1932, during a break in the West Coast racing schedule, Rajo Jack took Quinn's car on a tour of events in Texas, Kansas, and Oklahoma. There, he was taken by a young woman named Ruth Grace and settled down in Oklahoma City for just as long as it took to convince Ruth's parents to let him marry her. In August, they were wed and headed back to California so Rajo could continue racing. He managed to find a car for an event at Silvergate Speedway on New Year's Day in 1933, but it wasn't an easy decision. Competing in a non-AAA event meant Rajo would become ineligible for a AAA racing license and also have his mechanics license revoked, but it was a risk he decided to take. but it had been almost a decade since Rajo was in the cockpit, and he was rusty. He failed to make the feature race. Still, in 1934, he had a shot at racing for the full season at Silvergate, and Rajo accepted. At the season opener, he placed second in the main event. Track promoter Charlie Courier saw an opportunity in Rajo and formed a close relationship with him. By promoting that his track allowed a black man to race, Courier was able to draw in curious spectators, and in turn, Rajo took his first win. One thing that characterizes Rajo Jack's racing career, though, is its ups and downs. For every intoxicating victory came a period of poor performances that strained Rajo's credibility. Making things worse, just as his career had started to take off in the mid-1930s, his family began falling apart. First, he lost his brother, then his sister. His relationship with his wife grew strained as Rajo funneled money into a racing career that only sometimes paid off. And when it did, Rajo took that prize money and poured it directly back into a car he was building for himself, hoping he would never have to rely on anyone else for a ride. Nevertheless, Rajo became one of the stars of the outlaw racing circuit. Promoters from tracks in Northern California began to pay him tow money if he'd show up to their races, and he and fellow outlaw Bayless Leverett began caravanning together up and down the West Coast. At some tracks like San Jose Speedway, billboards advertised Rajo Jack as a star, someone worthy of buying a ticket to see compete. As his profile grew, so too did his opportunities. Rajo Jack was invited to compete in stock cars and midget cars. He took victory in a modified stock car race and won a whopping $1,500 and the attention of the national press. He began to make friends with other black folks in Hollywood and was becoming a star. And in 1937, he achieved a dream. His race car was completed, and in February, the Rajo Jack Special, complete with the Francis Quinn Miller engine, made its debut at Southern Speedway on February 11th. Sadly, his debut ended with a broken steering arm, and his luck didn't improve much after, as faults and failures plagued the season. But even if he suffered failures, Rajo was extremely consistent on the days where his cars could take the checkered flag. At the end of the year, Rajo Jack became the champion at Southgate Speedway. He donned the number 1 on the side of his car coming into the 1938 season, but it seemed to be a bad portent. He struggled to deliver on his promise in the early part of the year, then spent several weeks in Tyler, Texas after his mother died. He went back to racing, but it was his first winless year since 1933. In 1939, Rajo's profile continued to grow, as he was invited to compete in races up in Canada. But in April, a stone shattered Rajo's goggles and sent shards of glass into his eye. He finished the race and went back to competition immediately after having the glass removed. But on a July 4th motorcycle race, it all went wrong. On the first lap, another driver touched wheels with Rajo, and he smashed into the ground. His jaw was fractured, and the eye that was healed was re-injured. Doctors told Rajo that if they saved his eye, he'd never be able to race again. In turn, he asked them if removing the eye altogether would give him a chance at racing. It would be his best chance, the doctor said. And so at age 33, Rajo Jack had his left eye removed and replaced with a glass eye. He told no one, but it took months for his performances to improve. By the end of the year, he was back to his winning ways, hoping for the best for 1940, and 1940 was looking good. John A. Sloan, a promoter and head of the International Motor Contest Association, decided he needed some Californian blood to spice up his competition taking place on racetracks he sanctioned in the Midwest. Sloan first invited Bayless Leverett, who would tell him every single weekend that if Sloan really wanted to draw a crowd, he needed to bring out Rajo Jack. Sloan reached out to Rajo, and the two men went back and forth negotiating a fee. Finally, in 1940, they reached a settlement. Rajo would earn a tidy $500 every single week, plus whatever purse money he earned, and the IMCA purses were impressive. Almost immediately, he embarked on an aggressive racing schedule that saw him hauling his race car for hours a day and racing multiple times a week. But then, at the Des Moines Fairground, on the first lap, Rajo struck a car that had spun in front of him. He had broken his arm, fractured his skull, and suffered a concussion, but ambulance drivers at the track refused to take him to the hospital. They would not allow a black man in their vehicle. Instead, Rajo had to hitch a ride to the hospital in the bed of a truck owned by one of the car owners at the track. Rajo Jack's time with the IMCA came to a sudden and unfortunate end. For months, he couldn't work. He lost out on his paychecks from Midwest racing, and he couldn't work back in California. He had a broken car to repair and unpaid hospital bills in Iowa. Yet still he dedicated himself to repairing his machinery in the hope of racing in 1941. He managed to take the lead in the American Racing Association Championship at one point that year, even though he could no longer straighten the arm that he had broken. But by the end of that year, the United States was at war. After Japanese pilots bombed Pearl Harbor, racing came to a screeching halt as the government moved to preserve key resources and as healthy racing drivers either went off to serve or took on lucrative wartime jobs. Rajo was not one of those drivers. His injuries prevented him from enlisting, and his race resulted in few people wanting to hire him. With no events to pour himself into, he was lost, and as a result, his relationship with Ruth suffered. When racing returned in 1945, Rajo was one of the first men to enter local events. He tried to talk his way into the pits again at the Indy 500, but it didn't work. He went back to California, but his machinery was too far out of date for him to be competitive. Still, he found other ways to remain in racing. He mentored young black drivers and volunteered his services as a mechanic. He bought a car and began fielding it for other racers. He tried dabbling behind the wheel in 1949 and seemed to be on the path to resurgence. In 1950, he won 3 local racers, and promoters began using the Rajo Jack name to draw curious fans once again. He was 45 years old and still nursing his painful racing injuries, but that was not going to stop him. But that was largely it for Rajo Jack. While he still dreamed of racing, he took on work hauling oranges and antiques in 1954. Still, he was invited out to Honolulu, Hawaii for what promised to be a big NASCAR race, but it was one that turned out to be a disaster. The track itself was a mess, and far fewer fans turned up than expected, but it was just enough to get Rajo's name back in the newspaper. He tried to use the opportunity to restart his career, this time in NASCAR, and in 1956, he finally had some hope that his longtime dream of racing in the Indianapolis 500 was about to come true. 1955 had been a horrifying year for motorsport. Formula One ace Alberto Ascari was killed in Monza during a test session in May, and Bill Vukovich was killed at the Indianapolis 500. Then, in June, a Mercedes-Benz launched into a crowd at the 24 Hours of Le Mans, killing over 80 spectators. Motorsport around the world came to a halt as race organizers and sanctioning bodies attempted to find a new path forward. Some countries like Switzerland placed an immediate ban on racing, while in the United States, the AAA decided to step away from motorsport. Instead, Indianapolis Motor Speedway owner Tony Hulman founded his own sanctioning body, the United States Auto Club, to take over the race. With no AAA, Rajo Jack saw a chance. Perhaps this new organization, USAC, would be friendlier to black drivers. After all, it was being billed as a progressive and innovative new organization that was going to change the way things were done at Indy. Perhaps for the first time, a black driver or even a black car owner could debut at the Indianapolis 500. Rajo Jack would never find out. On February 27, 1956, Rajo and his brother Warren Gatson were hauling antiques out of Los Angeles when Rajo pulled over to the side of the road, citing chest pain. Warren took over the steering wheel and raced to the nearest hospital, but it was too late. Rajo Jack was dead at 50 years old. He was buried at Lincoln Memorial Park in Carson, California in March. Perhaps fittingly, his gravestone blended fact with fiction and reads, "In memory of Noel Gatson, famous race driver Rajo Jack DeSoto, 1896 to 1956. One of the struggles I've run into when I'm trying to communicate my love of pre-war motorsport to a new audience is trying to prove how that era is still relevant today. That can be so tough. The cars look drastically different and the technology has evolved so much. The big name characters have long since died. And when it comes to the drivers who never made it to the big time and who never earned a big section in the history books, it can be even harder. Rajo Jack as a driver may never have been able to live his dream of competing in the Indianapolis 500. He may not have become a world or a national or even a regional champion. He's also not really a name that ends up being passed around in diehard motorsport circles. I find that wild because I think Rajo Jack's story is an incredibly important one that's emblematic of the way bias can become so embedded in motorsport that we don't even notice it's there. Years ago, I wrote a story about Rajo Jack for Jalopnik, and more than one person reached out to ask me why. Why spend my time talking about this driver who seemingly achieved so little when I haven't spared a breath for legends like Louis Meyer or Wilbur Shaw? Why celebrate a man for the color of his skin and not for his accomplishments? To me, that completely misses the point. Rajo Jack couldn't have been more accomplished, and I mean that literally. Systematic biases and unfounded bigotry prevented him from doing something as simple as sitting in a grandstand next to a white person, let alone from ever having a shot at the most impressive racing events in the world. He was running into barriers from the moment he left the womb, and it feels foolish to pretend that those barriers didn't also exist in racing, even if they weren't explicitly written in the rule books. Other black drivers like Charlie Wiggins, Joy Ray, and Wendell Scott paved the way for racers of color in early years, but they were never welcomed in predominantly white racing circles. It wasn't until Willie T. Ribbs hit the scene that motorsport was forced to leave some prejudice at the door. Ribbs became the first black man to test a Formula One car back in 1986, and he was the first black man to compete in the Indianapolis 500 in 1991. In the modern era, we now have drivers like Sir Lewis Hamilton, but even the 7-time world champion's mind-boggling accomplishments haven't stopped hordes of people desperate to discount his accomplishments or to rank him as lesser than their favorite white driver. Motorsport was built in part on the incorrect yet persistent belief that some people are better than others thanks to innate and immutable things like the color of their skin. It created a system that has historically afforded more opportunities to white men than anyone else, and part of what makes that system so insidious is the fact that it wasn't written in a rule book. We were expected to believe that this was an inherent fact, and as the years passed, it left a gap in our understanding of motorsport's evolution. In order to have seemingly untouchable talents like Lewis Hamilton, we needed to have men like Rajo Jack, men who were audacious and who circumvented the odds, but whose results perhaps look a little bit less impressive than their peers. I've always believed the box score is only the tip of the iceberg, and the true story in sports lies somewhere below the surface. And that's the case for the protagonist of this episode. Rajo Jack deserves to be remembered. His life story provides a fascinating look into an oft-forgotten period of motorsport, and it also shines a light on some of the elements of racing that we may not be proud of. But it's important to know how top-tier racing organizations like the AAA treated men like Rajo Jack. It's important to understand that people of color have been routinely discriminated against in racing. If motorsport wants to grow, it needs to reckon with those uncomfortable elements of its history and to celebrate people like Rajo Jack who pursued their dream nevertheless. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Deadly Passion's Terrible Joys. In the next show, we're going to delve into the love life of one Enzo Ferrari, including his long affair with the widow of a driver who died racing one of his cars. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a rating, and leave a review. And if you're hungry for more, please subscribe to the DPTJ Patreon. DPTJ has also crowned 2 world champions in its very first season. I want to give a special shout out to Ryan Lorman and Nicole Washington, both of whom have gone above and beyond to support this podcast. To Ryan and Nicole, thank you so much for everything you've done to keep DPTJ trucking along. Finally, don't forget to check out Home Field Apparel to stock up on some absolutely incredible motorsport merch. And don't forget to use DPTJ15 for 15% off your first purchase. Finally, we're ending with La Source, the segment named after the iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps, but that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to be able to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm giving a shout out to some of the most influential sources at the end of each show. You can find the full list in my description. The primary source of this week's episode is an impeccably researched book by Bill Poehler titled The Brown Bullet, Rajo Jack's Drive to Integrate Auto Racing. Poehler tracked down everything you could ever want to know about a man whose name changed multiple times throughout his life and whose career was confined to the fringes of the motorsport world. If you want to know even more about the life of Rajo Jack, go grab yourself a copy. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.